For 10 years, Frank Miller had been part of the furniture at Miller's Market on Oak Street. Just another friendly face behind the checkout counter, scanning barcodes and asking paper or plastic to customers who barely looked up from their phones. At 75, he moved a little slower than the younger cashiers, but he was reliable, patient with elderly customers, and good with children who grew restless while their parents shopped. To the residents of Springfield, he was simply Mr. Frank, the polite retiree who worked part-time to stay busy. Until Tuesday afternoon, when 6-year-old Tommy Wilson reached across the counter to hand him a coupon and noticed the intricate pattern of old scars covering Frank's hands. "You have marks like my grandpa," the boy said with the innocent directness that only children possess. "He got hurt in the war." Frank paused mid-scan, looked into those curious young eyes, and spoke words he hadn't said to a customer in 10 years. "I was in the war too, son. Normandy, 1944. What followed would remind everyone in that grocery store that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear name tags and ask if you found everything you needed. Welcome to Forgotten Heroes Stories. Before we continue this touching story of recognition, sacrifice, and the freedom that was paid for with blood, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like Frank's deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. These voices matter, and your support helps us honor those who served. Miller's Market wasn't the fanciest grocery store in Springfield, but it had something the big chain stores lacked: a sense of community. The family-owned business had been serving the neighborhood for 40 years, and many of its customers had been shopping there since they were children themselves. It was the kind of place where the staff knew your name, where they'd set aside the good produce for regular customers, and where checkout conversations lasted longer than strictly necessary, because everyone understood that human connection was as important as commerce. Frank Miller had started working there in 2002, 3 years after retiring from his job at the post office. At 67, he'd found retirement too quiet, too empty of purpose. When Tom Miller Jr., no relation despite the shared surname, offered him part-time work as a cashier, Frank accepted gratefully. The job gave him structure, social interaction, and the satisfaction of being useful in his community. His shifts were Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., busy enough to keep him engaged, but not so demanding that it felt like real work. Frank worked Register 3, the one closest to the front window where afternoon sunlight streamed across the checkout counter. He'd memorized the produce codes, learned the quirks of the elderly cash register, and developed his own rhythm of efficient service mixed with genuine courtesy. Regular customers had grown accustomed to Frank's presence over the decade. Mrs. Henderson from Elm Street always asked about his health and shared updates about her grandchildren. The Rodriguez family appreciated that he spoke enough Spanish to help their elderly grandmother feel comfortable. Young mothers liked that Frank was patient when their children wanted to help scan items or count change. But what most customers noticed about Frank Miller was his hands. Not in an obvious way. He wasn't self-conscious about them, and he certainly didn't call attention to them. But his hands told a story that observant people couldn't help but notice. They were strong, despite his age, with fingers that moved precisely across the scanner and cash register keys. But they were also marked by an intricate network of white scars that caught the light when he reached for items or counted change. Most people assumed the scars were from decades of manual labor, perhaps from his postal service years, or from projects around his house. Frank never offered explanations, and the scars were old enough and faded enough that they seemed like just another part of his quiet, unremarkable presence behind the checkout counter. Linda Wilson had been shopping at Miller's Market since she'd moved to Springfield 8 years earlier, drawn by the store's friendly atmosphere and convenient location near her son's elementary school. She was a single mother working as a nurse at Springfield General Hospital, and the market's extended hours and personal service made her weekly grocery runs manageable, even with her demanding schedule. Her 6-year-old son Tommy was a frequent companion on these shopping trips, especially during summer break, when childcare was more complicated. Tommy was the kind of child who noticed everything, the kind who asked endless questions about how things worked, why people looked different, and what various machines and gadgets were designed to do. Linda had learned to budget extra time for grocery shopping because Tommy's curiosity often led to educational detours through the store. Tommy had his own relationship with Frank Miller. Though he didn't know the cashier's name, to the boy, Frank was simply the nice man at the checkout, who always had patience for his questions and never seemed annoyed when Tommy wanted to help scan items or load bags. Frank would let Tommy reach the scanner wand, guide his small hands to the right position, and praise him when the beep indicated a successful scan. "Good job, buddy," Frank would say, and Tommy would beam with pride at being helpful. Linda appreciated Frank's kindness toward her son. As a single mother, she was often stressed during shopping trips, trying to manage a cart full of groceries while keeping an energetic 6-year-old engaged and well-behaved. Frank's patient interaction with Tommy always made those trips a little easier, a little more pleasant. On Tuesday, July 15th, 2012, Linda and Tommy arrived at Miller's Market for their weekly shopping trip. Tommy had spent the morning at his grandfather's house, helping with yard work and listening to stories about the old days. His grandfather, Linda's father, was a Vietnam veteran who had always been open about his military service and the shrapnel wounds that had left permanent scars on his arms and legs. Tommy was still thinking about those stories as he and his mother moved through the store, collecting items from their carefully planned list. He'd been helping his grandfather organize old photographs and had seen pictures of young soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms, including several photos of his grandfather as a young man in jungle fatigues. By the time they reached Frank's checkout counter, Tommy's mind was full of questions about soldiers and wars and the scars that some people carried as reminders of their service. Frank Miller had been having a typical Tuesday afternoon at Miller's Market. The lunch rush had passed, leaving the store in its comfortable mid-afternoon lull. He'd checked out Mrs. Patterson with her weekly supply of cat food and frozen dinners, helped the Rodriguez family navigate a complicated coupon situation, and chatted with Bill Henderson about the upcoming baseball season. When Linda Wilson approached his register with Tommy in tow and a cart full of groceries, Frank smiled his usual greeting. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wilson. How are you today?" "Fine, thank you, Mr. Frank," Linda replied, beginning to unload items onto the conveyor belt. "Tommy's been helping his grandpa with yard work this morning, so he's full of energy." Frank glanced at Tommy, who was standing unusually close to the checkout counter, studying Frank with the intense curiosity that children sometimes displayed when something caught their attention. "Hello there, Tommy," Frank said, reaching for the first item on the belt, a gallon of milk. "Are you going to help me scan today?" But Tommy didn't respond to the invitation. Instead, he moved even closer to the counter, his eyes fixed on Frank's hands as they moved across the scanner and register. Frank noticed the boy's stare but didn't think much of it. Children often watched the checkout process with fascination, especially when they were allowed to participate. Frank continued scanning items, making light conversation with Linda about the weather and Tommy's summer activities, but he became increasingly aware that the boy was studying him with unusual intensity, following the movement of his hands with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. When Frank reached for a box of cereal near the edge of the counter, extending his arm fully, Tommy suddenly stepped forward and pointed at Frank's left hand. "You have marks like my grandpa," Tommy said loudly enough for Linda and several nearby customers to hear. "See, Mom? They look just like Grandpa's marks." Linda looked up from her purse, embarrassed by her son's directness. "Tommy, that's not polite to—" But Frank had stopped scanning and was looking down at his own hands, as if seeing them through the boy's eyes. The scars that he'd carried for nearly 70 years had become so much a part of him that he rarely thought about them anymore. But now, Viewed through the lens of a child's innocent observation, they suddenly seemed significant again. "Your grandfather has marks like these?" Frank asked quietly, setting down the cereal box and looking directly at Tommy. Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "Uh-huh. He got hurt in the war. He showed me pictures of when he was a soldier. He said the marks remind him of his friends who didn't come home." The checkout area had grown quiet. Linda stood frozen with her wallet in her hand, sensing that something important was happening, but not understanding what. A customer in line behind them had stopped unloading his cart, drawn by the unexpected turn in conversation. Frank looked from Tommy's eager face to Linda's concerned expression, then back down at his scarred hands. For a moment, he seemed to be weighing something in his mind, considering words he hadn't spoken to strangers in years. "I was in the war too, son," Frank said finally, his voice gentle but carrying new weight. "Normandy, 1944. Linda Wilson felt her breath catch in her throat. The friendly cashier who had been checking out her groceries for years, who had patiently helped her son scan items and learn to count change, was a World War II veteran. The scars on his hands weren't from yard work or household accidents. They were from battle. You fought in World War II?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank nodded, still looking down at his hands. "D-Day +7. June 13th, 1944. I was part of the follow-up waves that came ashore after the initial assault." Tommy looked confused by the adult terminology, but excited by the confirmation that Frank, like his grandfather, was a real soldier. "Did you get hurt fighting bad guys?" Tommy asked with a directness that made Linda want to apologize, but somehow seemed exactly right for the moment. Frank smiled at the boy's simple framing of complex history. "Yes, Tommy. There were some very bad people doing terrible things, and we had to stop them. I got hurt trying to help my friends, but we stopped the bad guys." He held up his hands, palms facing Tommy, so the boy could see the network of scars more clearly. "These are from when a German grenade went off too close to where I was trying to help a wounded soldier. The metal pieces, we called it shrapnel, went into my hands, but the army doctors fixed me up well enough to keep going." Linda found herself staring at Frank's hands with new understanding. What she had assumed were the ordinary marks of age and work were actually evidence of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. "Mr. Frank," she said slowly, "I had no idea. In all the years we've been coming here, you never mentioned—" "No reason to," Frank interrupted gently. "That was a long time ago, and it's not something you bring up while scanning groceries." The customer behind them in line, a middle-aged man Linda didn't recognize, had moved closer, clearly listening to the conversation. "Excuse me," he said respectfully, "but did you say you were at Normandy?" Frank looked up at him, nodding once. "Yes, sir. My grandfather was there too, 29th Infantry Division. He used to talk about how tough it was for the follow-up units, having to advance through all the aftermath of the initial assault." Frank's expression softened with recognition. The 29th were good soldiers. They took heavy casualties in the first waves. Your grandfather was a brave man. Tommy, who had been listening with the patience unusual for a 6-year-old, suddenly reached across the counter and gently touched Frank's left hand with his small finger, tracing one of the more prominent scars. "Does it still hurt?" he asked. Frank looked down at the boy's finger touching his old wound, and for a moment his composure wavered slightly. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "but not in the way you might think, Tommy. Sometimes old men—" Linda realized that other customers had begun to gather around Frank's checkout station, drawn by the unusual conversation. Word was spreading quietly through the store that the elderly cashier was sharing something extraordinary. But rather than feeling like a spectacle, the moment felt sacred, as if they were witnessing something rare and important. "Mr. Frank," Linda said, "would it be okay if Tommy asked you some questions? He's been learning about World War II from his grandfather, and I think this might be important for him to hear." Frank looked around at the small crowd that had gathered, then back at Tommy's expectant face. "I suppose I could answer a few questions. But first, let me finish checking out your groceries, Mrs. Wilson." He resumed scanning items, but now his movements carried different significance. These weren't just the hands of an elderly cashier. They were the hands of someone who had fought for freedom when freedom itself was in doubt. "Were you scared when you went to fight the bad guys?" Tommy asked as Frank scanned a box of crackers. "Terrified," Frank answered honestly. "Anyone who tells you they weren't scared is either lying or wasn't really there. The being scared doesn't mean you don't do what needs to be done." "How old were you?" asked the middle-aged customer whose grandfather had also served. 20 years old when I shipped out to England. 21 by the time we hit the beach at Normandy." Linda tried to imagine Frank as a 20-year-old soldier, younger than many of her fellow nurses, facing the most significant military operation in history. What was it like, she found herself asking. Frank paused in his scanning, considering how to answer such an enormous question. "Loud," he said finally, "and confusing, and sad, but also necessary. We knew what we were fighting for, even if we couldn't always see it in the moment." "What were you fighting for?" Tommy asked. Frank looked directly at the boy. "For you, Tommy. For your mom. For the right of families to go grocery shopping on a Tuesday afternoon, without worrying about soldiers kicking down their door. For the freedom to ask questions and get honest answers." He turned to Linda. "We fought so your son could grow up in a country where he gets to choose what he wants to be when he grows up, where he can go to school and learn to read whatever books he wants to read." The simple explanation seemed to satisfy Tommy, but it hit Linda with unexpected emotional force. This man, this quiet, unassuming cashier, had literally risked his life so that she and her son could live the ordinary life they took. Word of Frank's revelation spread through Miller's Market with the quiet efficiency that news travels in small communities. Tom Miller, Jr., the store owner, emerged from his office to see what was causing the unusual gathering around Register 3. Other employees, stockers, the deli counter staff, even customers from different aisles found reasons to drift toward the front of the store. But this wasn't a crowd drawn by curiosity or spectacle. It was a community recognizing something important happening in their midst. "Frank," Tom Miller Jr. said as he approached the checkout counter, "I've been your boss for 10 years, and I never knew you were a veteran." Frank looked slightly embarrassed by the attention. "Never came up, Tom. You hired me to check out groceries, not to talk about ancient history." "Ancient history?" said Mrs. Patterson, who had returned to the store after hearing from a neighbor that something remarkable was happening. "Mr. Frank, what you did in the war isn't ancient history. It's the foundation of everything we have today." Tommy, still standing close to the counter, looked up at Frank with new understanding. "Are you famous?" Frank chuckled. "No, Tommy, I'm not famous. I was just one of millions of young men who did what needed to be done. But millions of people don't work at our grocery store," Tommy pointed out with 6-year-old logic. "Just you." The observation hit everyone present with its simple truth. Here, in their everyday neighborhood market, was a living link to one of the most important events in human history. And for 10 years, they had all walked past him without recognizing the extraordinary life hidden behind his ordinary work. "Mr. Frank," said Maria Rodriguez, whose family had been shopping at the store for years, My grandmother escaped from Nazi Germany in 1938. She always said that American soldiers saved the world. She would have wanted to thank you." Frank's expression grew serious. "Your grandmother was brave to leave everything behind and start over in a new country. That took a different kind of courage than what we soldiers showed." Linda found herself thinking about all the times she had hurried through Frank's checkout line, focused on her phone or her to-do list, barely acknowledging the man who was helping her. How many other customers had done the same thing, missing the chance to connect with someone who had helped shape the world they all lived in? "Mr. Frank," she said, "would you be willing to tell Tommy more about the war sometime? Maybe when you're not working? I think it would be good for him to understand what people like you did for all of us." Frank looked at Tommy, who was nodding enthusiastically at the idea, then back at Linda. "I suppose I could do that, but only if Tommy promises to ask good questions." "I promise," Tommy said immediately. "I have lots of questions." Over the next few weeks, Frank Miller's life at Miller's Market changed in subtle but significant ways. Customers who had barely acknowledged him for years now stopped to chat, to thank him for his service, or simply to treat him with the respect they felt they should have shown all along. But Frank handled the attention with the same quiet grace he had brought to everything else in his life. He didn't become boastful or start every conversation with war stories. Instead, he answered questions when asked, shared memories when appropriate, and continued to focus on doing his job well. Linda Wilson kept her promise to bring Tommy back for more conversations with Frank. During his breaks, Frank would sit with the boy at one of the small tables near the store's deli counter, answering questions about history and sharing stories about courage, friendship, and the importance of standing up for what's right. "Mr. Frank," Tommy asked during one of these conversations, "why didn't you tell people you were a hero?" Frank considered the question carefully. "Because I don't think of myself as a hero, Tommy. Heroes are people who choose to help others even when they don't have to. I was a soldier doing my job. The real heroes were the men who didn't make it home, who gave up everything so the rest of us could have families and ordinary lives." "But you chose to be a soldier," Tommy pointed out. "Actually, I was drafted," Frank admitted. "The Army chose me, but you're right that I chose how to do the job once I got there." These conversations became a regular part of Tommy's week, and Linda found herself looking forward to them as much as her son did. There was something profound about watching her child learn about courage and sacrifice from someone who had lived those values rather than just read about them. Other customers began to recognize what was happening in their store. Miller's Market had always been more than just a place to buy groceries. It had been a community gathering spot where neighbors connected with each other. But now it had become something more, a place where history was alive and accessible, where the abstract concept of freedom could be understood through the scarred hands of someone who had fought for it. One afternoon in late August, Tommy arrived at the store with a school assignment. He was supposed to interview someone who had lived through an important historical event. His teacher had suggested he might talk to a grandparent or elderly neighbor about events like the Kennedy assassination or the moon landing. "Mr. Frank," Tommy said, when he found Frank stocking shelves during a quiet period, "could I interview you for school about the war?" Frank looked up from the canned goods he was organizing. "What kind of interview, Tommy?" "I have to ask questions and write down the answers. About what it was like to live through important history." Frank smiled. "I suppose D-Day qualifies as important history. But are you sure your teacher will believe that the grocery store cashier was actually there?" Tommy looked confused. "Why wouldn't she believe it?" "Well, most people don't expect to find World War II veterans working in grocery stores." "But why not?" Tommy asked, with the logic that only children possess. "Where else would they work?" The question was so innocent, and yet so profound, that Frank found himself laughing. "You know what, Tommy? You're absolutely right. Where else would we work? That evening, with Linda's permission and Tom Miller Jr.'s blessing, Frank sat down with Tommy for a formal interview that the boy recorded on his mother's phone. The questions were sometimes simple, sometimes surprisingly deep, but always honest. "What was the scariest part of the war?" Tommy asked. "Not knowing if I'd ever see my family again," Frank answered. "And knowing that other young men, some of them younger than I was, would never see their families again." "What was the best part?" Frank thought for a long moment. "The friendships. When you go through something really difficult with other people, you form bonds that last forever. Some of my closest friends were men I met in the Army, even though many of them didn't make it home." "Do you ever wish you hadn't gone to war?" Another long pause. "No, Tommy. I wish there hadn't been a war to fight. But since there was, I'm glad I got to be part of stopping it." "What do you want kids like me to know about what you did?" Frank looked directly into the camera of Linda's phone. "I want you to know that freedom isn't free. It's not something that just happens automatically. Every generation has to choose whether to protect it or let it slip away. We chose to protect it. Someday, you might have to make that choice too." Tommy's interview with Frank Miller became more than just a school assignment. When his teacher, Mrs. Peterson, watched the recording, she was so moved that she asked Linda's permission to share it with the school's principal. The principal, in turn, contacted the local newspaper. Within a week, a reporter from the Springfield Gazette was sitting at one of Miller's Market's deli tables interviewing Frank about his wartime service and his decade of quiet work as a grocery clerk. The resulting article, titled "Local Grocery Clerk's Hidden Heroism," was picked up by the regional paper and then by a veterans organization newsletter. But Frank's response to the attention was characteristically modest. "I just want people to understand," he told the reporter, "that there are probably veterans like me all around them. We don't wear our service on our sleeves because we're not trying to impress anyone. We're just trying to live good lives and contribute to our communities." The article did accomplish something important, though. It reminded readers to pay attention to the people around them, to recognize that extraordinary stories often hide behind ordinary faces. Miller's Market began to see an increase in customers, people who came not just to shop, but to meet Frank and hear his perspective on history and service. Tom Miller Jr. was worried at first that the attention might be overwhelming for his elderly employee, but Frank handled it with the same steady grace he brought to everything else. "It's nice to be able to talk about these things," Frank told his boss. "For so many years, it felt like people weren't interested in what my generation went through. Now I feel like maybe our experiences matter to people again." The most meaningful recognition, though, came from Tommy Wilson. For his school's Veterans Day assembly, Tommy asked if Frank would be willing to speak to his class about the war and about service. Frank's presentation was simple and honest. He talked about being young and scared, but doing your duty anyway. He talked about friendship and sacrifice and the importance of protecting the freedoms that allow children to go to school safely. But the moment that everyone remembered came at the end, when Tommy stood up and said, "Mr. Frank taught me that heroes don't have to be famous. They just have to help other people. And he's been helping my mom and me buy groceries for my whole life." Frank Miller continued working at Miller's Market until he was 81 years old, when a minor heart attack forced him into retirement. But his impact on the store and the community extended far beyond his decade of service. The checkout counter where he had worked became known informally as Frank's Station, and new employees were often told the story of the quiet cashier who had turned out to be a war hero. Tommy Wilson, now a teenager, still stopped by the store regularly to visit with Frank when he was feeling nostalgic or needed advice about growing up. Linda Wilson, inspired by her son's relationship with Frank, began volunteering with a local veterans organization, helping to connect elderly veterans with community resources and recognition. She often said that Frank had taught her family to see people differently, to recognize that everyone has a story worth knowing. The most lasting impact, though, was on the customers who had learned to really see the people who served them. The story of Frank Miller reminded them that grocery clerks, postal workers, janitors, and security guards might be carrying extraordinary histories. It encouraged them to engage with the people around them as individuals rather than just service providers. Tom Miller, Jr. kept a framed copy of Tommy's school interview behind the customer service counter, along with the newspaper article about Frank's service. When new employees asked about it, he would tell them Frank's story and remind them that every customer they served might have their own remarkable history. Frank's scarred hands, which had seemed like just another detail of an aging worker, became a symbol of something larger, the reminder that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized, doing ordinary work with extraordinary grace. When Frank died peacefully in 2018, at the age of 85, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, not just through his military service, but through his quiet kindness as a neighbor, employee, and friend. Tommy Wilson, now a college student studying education, spoke at the service about the man who had taught him that heroism comes in many forms. "Mr. Frank showed me that you don't have to do something famous to be important," Tommy said. "You just have to show up every day and do your best to help other people." He did that as a soldier, and he did that as a grocery clerk. Both kinds of service mattered. The heroes of the greatest generation didn't disappear when World War II ended. They became our neighbors, our co-workers, our community volunteers. They took jobs as grocery clerks and postal workers, teachers and mechanics, contributing quietly to the communities they had helped save. Frank Miller's story reminds us that extraordinary people often live ordinary lives, that the cashier ringing up your groceries might have once helped liberate Europe, that the maintenance worker fixing your building might have survived battles that shaped the world we live in today. But this story is also about recognition, about the importance of really seeing the people around us, of understanding that everyone has a history worth knowing and respecting. It took the innocent observation of a 6-year-old boy to reveal Frank Miller's remarkable past. But how many other Frank Millers do we encounter every day without ever learning their stories? The scars on Frank's hands were visible to anyone who looked, but it took someone asking the right question to understand what those scars represented. How many other signs of extraordinary lives do we miss because we're too busy, too distracted, or too focused on our own concerns to really notice the people serving us? So I challenge you. The next time you interact with a cashier, a security guard, a janitor, or any other service worker, take a moment to really see them as a person. Ask how their day's going. Express genuine appreciation for their work. You might discover that you're talking to someone who has lived through remarkable experiences and has wisdom to share. Share in the comments. Have you ever been surprised to learn about someone's hidden history? Have you discovered that a person you see regularly had experiences you never imagined? Let this be a place where we celebrate the extraordinary people living ordinary lives all around us. Subscribe to Forgotten Heroes Stories if you believe that everyone deserves to be seen and respected for their full humanity. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories that remind us to look beyond the surface and recognize the heroes hiding in plain sight. Tomorrow, we'll share another story of quiet courage and unexpected recognition. Until then, remember, the most important stories are often carried by the people we notice least. Take the time to see them, to know them, and to honor the lives they've lived in service to others. Thank you for listening, thank you for seeing, and thank you for understanding that heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as quiet as a grocery clerk who helped save the world and then spent decades helping families feed theirs.